Hey guys, Pedro here to tell you about the latest from 200 Stab Wounds Manual Manic Procedures, out June 28th on Metal Blade Records. The album has 9 tracks, 29 minutes in length, and this is the band's second full-length studio album. They are an American death metal band. Now, before I even pressed play on this record, considering 9 songs, 29 minutes, I was expecting this album to be extremely dense and compact. No room to breathe. Brutality from minute 1 until minute 29. And once I pressed play, I realized, wow, that's really not the case. The album is heavy. I don't think these guys can do a soft record anyway. So the album is heavy, and it has a lot of aggression, and it has a lot of intensity. But it's an album that also has a lot of breaks. And the breaks don't come in between songs. The breaks don't come because of an acoustic interlude. The breaks come in the actual construction of the individual songs. There are a lot of long intros in these tracks, and some of them even with outros. So these intros and outros, what they do is that they create the breaks, they create the ripples in the record that allow the album to not be super dense and compact, almost stretching out the overall playability and the overall length of the album, allowing you to feel like there's more of a roller coaster ride in the overall experience, and that makes the album better. It gives it more energy, gives it more life, and even these perhaps softer pockets, these intros, outros, what they do is they make everything around them feel a lot heavier. For example, the electronic synth that opens Manual Manic Procedures feels completely out of place at first glance, but the way it introduces the song, the way it dilutes that heaviness at the start, it sets up the heaviness that comes right after, making everything feel 100 times bigger, 100 times more powerful. So super intelligent way of creating songs that have almost their own built-in interludes, and that makes the record feel more complete all around, and it definitely makes it more engaging, and it creates a much better listening experience for whoever sits down and presses play on this album. Now, as far as sound is concerned, I already said this is a heavy record. I don't think you can expect anything else from 200 Stab Wounds. The question is, how did they go about it? Outside of what I explained in terms of the intros, outros, and the flow of the album, the sound on this record has a little bit of an old school aroma to it. That doesn't mean that the album feels dated. It's not the case. It's an album that piggybacks off of the more traditional, straightforward death metal sound, and you hear that in the guitars. And the guitars have a very distinct approach with this thick distortion that it's there from minute 1 until the last minute, becoming the calling card of the record. And that ties into a little bit of an old school flavor as far as death metal is concerned. But I feel like there are enough elements, not just in the sound, but in the construction of the songs, that allows this record to start to define who 200 Stab Wounds are, and perhaps who they're going to be. I think this is a defining album from that standpoint. Is a more mature record, is a record that sound-wise is more balanced, has better quality, and it's an album that also allows you to see not just where they are, but where they're heading. Is an album that has purpose in its sound. Everything is happening for a reason. It's not just heavy for the sake of being heavy, for the sake of creating the heaviest album ever. That's not the intent here. The intent here is to create a heavy album that still has some groove, that still makes you move to it, and that engages the listener at every turn. And you see that engagement specifically coming from the guitars first and foremost. I already mentioned that distortion, that thick distortion sound, that's the calling card of the guitars and of this record from start to finish. I love that sound. It's just something that I've always enjoyed, and if I see it on a record, and if I see it well executed, adding some thrash metal elements into the way this death metal album sounds, infusing some nuances, some ripples within these tracks, allowing the guitars to have this bass line approach, that you're going to have this uniform sound, but then breaking away from it, specifically with the solos. A solo like the one that opens Release the Stench. That is a sick solo to open up that song in the right spot. Very old school approach in terms of where it sits within the track, and even how it sounds. It just has this old school death metal feel to it. So you see the solos breaking apart a little bit from that overall heaviness of the record, that overall heaviness of the guitars, but it doesn't break away completely. It's not like the solos feel like they were an afterthought. The solos add value, and they have some roots in what the sound of the album is all about. Obviously, brighter, cleaner, more over the top, but there's residues of that distortion piggybacking into the solos that allows the connection between the two worlds not to be completely far apart, not to be completely distant. There's a little bit of a better connection between them. Then you have the drum sound that it's really heavy on this album, but it's heavy, but it also has substance behind it, and it pairs up really well with the guitars. And when it separates itself from the guitars, it feels like it picks up even more heaviness. It's heavy with the guitars together, even heavier outside of that parameter. And I really enjoy the drum sound all around. I felt like it gave this album a big kick. It gave it a big presence, a big footprint. And then another element that I enjoyed tremendously was the bass. The bass on this record pops quite a bit, and it really sneaks up on you because you're listening to a track and you feel like you could hear the bass, but the bass is layered in between the other sounds, and obviously the heaviness of drums and guitars, it's kind of overshadowing it, and you're like, wow, I feel like there's a little bit of bass there, but you're not quite sure. Then it comes in and it's like, oh, it was the bass. So when it disappears again, or when it hides itself again, it doesn't completely hide itself because you heard it already. So it almost sets this seed in your mind of what it sounds like, of what it feels like. And then even when it's not as predominant, you can still take it, you can still hold on to it, you can still enjoy it. And in some songs, it takes a little bit more of a center stage. And I felt like the bass not only had grit, but it had groove. And at times, it even helped the guitars feel and sound a little groovier. And I think that's important in a death metal album, in order to give the death metal sound in general a little bit more, to be a little bit more rich, not to be just one-dimensional. You want to create more dimensions to the sound and to the experience. And I felt like in such a short time frame of 29 minutes, they definitely achieved that. And then the vocals perhaps is the one element that stays more constant from beginning to end. Steve has a very pronounced delivery that works really well for the band and for their sound, and I felt like it worked really well on this record because it lifted up the aggression of the album, it lifted up the heaviness of the album, it allowed it to bubble all the way to the surface, creating an all-around super intelligent record. It really feels like a smart album because it has a lot of the DNA of the band. It feels like almost a live record. It has that experience of what the band sounds like. It has about the length of one of their live sets when they're on tour supporting other bands. So this record has a lot of that DNA of what it meant for them to be on the road since their debut record. They took that experience into this album, created an album that I feel if they were to play it live, it would work across every single track. It would work from beginning to end. They wouldn't really have to replace any song because this is a live album recorded in a studio. Now, as far as favorite songs are concerned, I want to start off with Gross Abuse. Heavy hitter, both musically and vocally. Thick and heavy distorted guitar sound that is a trademark not just of this track but of the entire album, and that grimy bass breaking through in the mix, allowing you to see that extra grooviness, that extra grime, that it's so cool on this record. That's sometimes underused by other bands, but these guys really did a phenomenal job with it. Then you have the vocals coming in, compounding the brutality of the song and enhancing that same brutality. A track that not only sounds heavy on the guitar side, it has some really heavy drums as well. So a really cool track all around. Next we have Flesh from Within. The drums and guitars interlace themselves with the bass in order to create this thick wall of sound. And it's a thick wall of sound that starts, but then that wall of sound not dilutes itself, but loses a little bit of its shape, of its strength, and the track becomes a lot more driven. It has more of a sense of direction, even including some groovier elements into the sound. The vocals find a way of always catching up to where the song is going and how the song is going, and this allows the track to have great movement, not lose its heaviness, just give some direction to where that heaviness needs to go. Great solo section, and then it closes off in a more stripped down guitar sound that brings this somber nature that allows this outro of the track to become the interlude that connects with the opening of the following song. This is really important on this record. The way they work these elements were super intelligent in terms of giving diversity to the individual songs, but still finding a way to connect one track to another, really creating almost a seamless flow. Last but definitely not least, Ride the Flatline featuring Jamie Morgan of Code Orange. And this is a very interesting track, not just because of the feature on it, because of the dual vocals on it, but even the sound that this song has allows it to stand out in the crowd because it's unique musically and vocally. The bass slaps on this song, the drums sound super heavy, and the guitars are very heavy and very driven, not losing that DNA experience that you're gonna find from the first all the way to the last song. The solo, there's a little bit of a guitar lick slash solo that brings in almost a psychedelic vibe in the halfway mark of this song, and that's really interesting because it plays, it's almost like the trigger that changes this song, that becomes a little bit more of a dynamic track, that becomes a little bit heavier, that becomes a little bit more aggressive, and then with two vocalists coming in, you have that feeding off of one another, and the track becomes complete in its essence. But that moment there, that little guitar lick, that little solo that had that psychedelic vibe, that is the turning point on this song that allows everything to go off the rails but be controlled. This controlled chaos, I would say the last half of this song versus the beginning of the track, that felt a little bit more paced, that felt like it had a little bit more boundaries. Once that happens, those boundaries are gone and everything is kind of becoming chaotic, both musically and vocally, especially when you have two different vocals. It adds to that controlled chaos. But really interesting song all around, both musically and vocally. This is it, 200 Stab Wounds Manual Manic Procedures, out June 28th on Metal Blade. Hit me up in the comment section, let me know your thoughts on the band. I'll see you all at the next video. Take care, guys.